We have Courtney Grimes with us. We've heard a lot of great advice from our jocks who's given us practical advice as to things we can do during transition, from our diet, from our relationships, and even how, as we're going through our transition, how we can positively affect our community. Well, this is the part of the show where I have a great friend of mine, Courtney Grimes. She's a clinical psychologist, and what we want to do right now is really just talk about what's going on in our heads. What is really going on behind the scenes when we're transitioning? So, Courtney, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
You tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I am based in Nashville, Tennessee. I have been working with professional athletes for almost 10 years now in a clinical capacity. So I've seen folks transition from the high school level to college, from playing college ball to pro, and then the transition, which can be extremely hard, from transferring from pro to sort of what I call civilian life, which can be very difficult.
So what goes on in our heads when we're changing from one environment to the next?
Absolutely. First, to answer that question, we are always transitioning from one environment to the next. If you think about it, from the day that we're born until the day we die, it's one giant transition. You never really arrive, you never really get there. And so for athletes, it's always one after the other, one transition after the other. And I think probably the scariest transition for athletes is when they leave the field, when they leave the rink, when they leave the court, and they start to have a day-to-day existence void of their specialty, void of the one thing that they felt really made them unique. What I think a lot of our athletes forget is that they've already been through a series of transitions their whole lives, and they made it just fine, right? So they transitioned beautifully from high school to college. They transitioned beautifully from college to pro. But all of a sudden, the rules seem to change. And what's happening in our mind whenever we have a giant transition or what feels like a big transition is fear. It's fear of the unknown. We as human animals are wired to be afraid of what we don't know and what we don't understand. And so as I see these athletes who leave the field and they move into civilian life, they've never really had that type of day-to-day life. It can be terrifying and very disorienting.
So when people are transitioning, when they have that change, it's actually somewhat ironic, because it seems like the higher you get in success, the further it is to the ground.
That's right.
So I know for myself transitioning, one of the biggest issues was separating what I did from who I am. Because sports was consistent, high school, college, the pros. Sports, you knew you could set your calendar by it. You had consistency. You had a sense of normalcy. Not necessarily enjoyment, but purpose. When it's gone, what are some coping mechanisms? What are some things as the person going through it? Some of the things that people resort to, and then especially for kids and wives that see their spouses or husbands, right, that see their spouses going through, and they can tell something's not right, but they can't put their finger on it.
First thing I would recommend is empathy, kindness. These folks who are transitioning from a career of athleticism to more of a civilian career, we have no idea what that's like. And I don't want to try to assume that I know what that's like. What I would recommend is ask a lot of questions. What's happening? What do you feel? What are you worried about? What are you scared of? How can I help? My feeling of coping mechanisms. Coping mechanisms are meant to deal with trauma, short-term or long-term trauma. Now, the idea that I'm using a coping mechanism, it needs to be kind of short-term. Because if I'm using coping mechanisms to move through my new normal, that means I have a life I have to cope with. So I have seen folks turn to drinking, turn to drugs, turn to sex or shopping or whatever it is to help them leave the present moment. The present moment seems so painful and so unbearable that they are willing to resort to anything to get them out of their body. This hurts. It hurts too much. I'm too scared. I don't know who I am anymore. I used to be a brand. I was a product. My value as a human is tied to a performance. And then when that gets severed, they feel a little disoriented. They feel disoriented. They feel untethered, I think is the right word, right? And so we are looking to feel safe. We're looking to feel secure. And so we'll see a lot of these folks sort of latch on to other things to sort of help ease the pain. And my ultimate goal and hope would be that everyone realizes that this is totally normal. It's almost unavoidable, right? So the transition out of a career in sports, the pain that's going to inevitably come with that is not only unavoidable, but that doesn't really interest me. What interests me is what you choose to do with that pain. Do you bathe in it? Do you wallow in it? Do you sort of spiral downward? Or do you use that to shine outward and help benefit other people? So I think that a lot of the things that partners can do, children, friends, someone that you know, someone that you love, if you're watching them sort of go through this transition, they might even take on a different kind of personality. They might have traits that show up that they have never had before, or they might start engaging in kind of some self-destructive behaviors, right, that they're using to cope with this transition because it's so hard. It's really, really hard. Of course it is. Ask them, are you okay?
I think one issue when I listen is the perception of athletes that go from high school to college to professional life. Part of what society sees are pampered children. They see people who have the doors open for them. You don't really have to pass. You just got to show up to class. You always get in the line. You're skipping the lines. So I think part of what's hard to hear is having such grace with somebody that you perceive to be spoiled. So how can somebody work through? It's kind of like, how does somebody work through that in regards to getting over yourself and the way you see the other person? Because the transition is part of coming down from who you thought you were.
Very well said. Very well said. Well, a very wise man I know told me that if you can conquer yourself, you can conquer the world. And I think by turning inward and really being able to face some of your own demons, I think that you are able to give back. I think you're able to live beyond yourself. And I would advise everyone who looks at athletes with the assumption that they are all spoiled children, please remember not to make assumptions about anybody. And at the end of the day, we are all human animals and we're all the same. We all have the same drive. We have the same needs. We all need to be loved and be loved in return. And no matter how we get to our end game, we all get to that end game. And try not to make assumptions and try to look for more similarities between you and some of these folks than differences, because there's way more alike than there is different.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this. What is the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist?
Sure, I get asked that question a lot. Psychiatry is medicine. So psychiatrists are actual MDs. They go to medical school with a psychiatric specialty. So if you see a psychiatrist, you are going for medication implementation or medication management. Now what I do is the psychology piece. I am trained to clinically sort of pinpoint outdated apps in your mind and sort of rewire the outdated apps and reformat them in an updated app that works better for you to change your mind, to change your reactions, to change your behavior, and to change your life.
So what I'm hearing is, in the same way athletes, we can develop our bodies through nutrition, through working out. With technology, we can do the same thing with our mind.
Yes, sir. All day.
So this is not new information. These are not new discoveries.
No, this is age-old information. in our country, in America, sadly, a lot of this is not public information, right? So it seems very novel to us because this isn't part of our normal conversation. This is not at the forefront of what we're talking about as a country. But the limit to the human mind is completely unknown. It is unknown. This organ controls your entire reality. So the more self-care you can implement, the better the fruits of that labor will be.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for joining us this week for Joccupation. Courtney, thank you so
Absolutely.
much for being a part of the show. And now, your weekly motivational speech. Thank you so much for joining us this week for Joccupation. I hope you enjoyed the motivational speech from Dave Nichols that will continue to dream, adapt, and overcome. Please join us next week when we'll be discussing purpose.